Welcome, everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Adam Stolberg, and I'm professor and chair of the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs. And it's really my great pleasure today to host today's event, which really marks the kickoff of the 2020-2021 Sam Nunn Bank of America Policy Forum. Thanks to the generous support by our good friends at Bank of America since the mid-1990s already. We've been fortunate to be able to host a marquee event that brings together noted academics, government officials, policy experts, private sector experts to discuss global challenges and opportunities to the nation that are presented really at the nexus of science, technology, and international affairs. This year, our theme is reinventing U.S. leadership in the transatlantic community. Amid changing science, read pandemics, and a technological landscape. And we're, unlike previous years where we have traditionally held these events on a single day, this year we're opening and unleashing really a series of virtual discussions, panel discussions, and interactive engagement. And so this year, primarily in 2021, we're going to be partnering with institutions like the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace to discuss some of the contemporary challenges and opportunities for U.S. leadership from both American and European perspectives, with the very esteemed statespeople such as Ambassador William Burns and the former head of foreign policy of the EU, Ms. Federica Mogherini. We'll also be partnering with the Carnegie Endowment to have a panel of experts discuss some of those challenges in a little bit more detail, and that'll be in the second part of the spring. And then in the fall, we'll have a couple of culminating events, including a scenario exercise that will be designed by students here at Georgia Tech that integrates some of the emerging technologies with the nuclear equation to discuss some of the issues facing risk reduction, and we'll be working with partners on that set of programming. So please stay tuned over 2021 for a series of dialogues related to reinventing U.S. Global leadership. And as I mentioned, the first one will take place at the end of January. I think it's January 28th, and we will send out notices accordingly. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm so excited about that. And I can't think of really a better way to launch this effort than to feature lessons on global leadership from our own namesake, the patron senator, if you will, of Georgia, Senator Sam Nunn. And for this, I'm thrilled to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Frank Leith Jones, who just finished a book. It's really hot off the presses and is arguably the definitive work on Senator Nunn's years in the Senate. That really highlights Senator Nunn's leadership role. And that new book is entitled Sam Nunn, the Statesman of the Nuclear Age. And it's published by the University of Kansas Press, and you can see the link to the press where you can purchase it in the announcement that went out to you, but it's also on our website. And Frank is currently a professor of security studies at the U.S. Army War College, and he was retired as an executive service person who was in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and he was also a commissioned officer in the U.S. Army. His previous work highlighted the biography of Robert Comer and how that interfaced with the Vietnam War and U.S. grand strategy, and it was a prize-winning opus, and we expect the same with this new opus. Frank has agreed to share some of his thoughts on his book that features Senator Nunn's years in the Senate, and then to engage in a moderated discussion. And before I turn it over to Frank, I just want to share a personal note that this is an event that's been a long time coming for me. I've had the fortune to work with Senator Nunn for many years, but those were the years after his Senate period, and I've heard a lot of stories, and I'm glad to see that there's one book that I can go to put them all together. So Frank, we're looking forward to your comments. And Frank, as I mentioned, will speak for about 10, 15 minutes, and then we'll turn to a moderated Q&A. So let me note that for anyone who wants to ask questions, please use the Q&A function here in the Blue Jeans video conference set up. And I will corral some of those questions and then ask them accordingly. So let me turn it over to you now, Frank.
Thank you, Adam. I appreciate that. And I want to thank you and the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs and to Georgia Tech and especially Senator Nunn for the opportunity to talk about the book this afternoon. It's really a privilege for me to be, if you will, on the virtual dais with Secretary Nunn again, Senator Nunn again. It's also a pleasure on my part to express my thanks to the Dirksen Congressional Center for the research grant that it made and gave to me and made this book possible, and the subvention it provided for the publication of the book by the University Press of Kansas. As Adam mentioned, I'm a professor at the U.S. Army War College, so I have to make this official disclaimer that my remarks today are simply my own opinions, my own observations, and entirely not representative of the positions or the policies of the Department of Defense, the U.S. government, or the Army. Let me begin by pointing out that 8 years ago, Dana Milbank, the Washington Post columnist, wrote an opinion piece decrying what he called the lack of giants in the U.S. Senate, figures of stature, admired by the colleagues. And he wrote about those figures as having, and I quote, authority that could transcend party and the usual arithmetic of vote counting, end quote. And Milbank specifically noted 6 esteemed leaders that had served since the 1960s. And one of them is Senator Sam Nunn. Now, as you probably know, perhaps, that Senator Nunn served 24 years in the Senate from his election in 1972 until his retirement in 1996, a period, as I said, of more than 2 decades. And I think if we look at that period from 72, the beginning of the end of the war, of the Vietnam War, all the way through the Cold War until the end of the Soviet Union in 1991, and the years after that, in which there was a great deal of turbulence and uncertainty about the U.S. role in the world, we can see how expansive and how much he was part of a changing environment. As a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and certainly ultimately as its chairman, he was very much an important part of the critical national security and defense issues of the Cold War era and the so-called New World Order that followed. And I include within that some that are perhaps even relevant to the discussion or the point that Adam made earlier, the revitalization of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, particularly its military capability, U.S.-Soviet relations, national defense organization and reform, the Persian Gulf conflict, and nuclear arms control. And I'd like to offer a brief overview of Senator Nunn's career by highlighting some of the significant moments and events that I recount in the book that demonstrate his leadership. And I think it's a leadership that transcends and goes far beyond the U.S. Senate, and the impact he's had on U.S. foreign policy, national security, and America's place in the world. And how he was even considered by colleagues and others as the Senate's and certainly even the Congress's leading expert on defense and national security issues. So while my book is a first full account of his career, showing how he was a congressional leader and a shadow, if you will, Secretary of Defense, Senator Nunn helped to win the Cold War, I would argue, constructing the foundation for the defense and foreign policies of the 1970s and the 1980s that secured the United States and its allies from the Soviet threat. Now, leadership, as you know, does not occur instantaneously. It is a product of experience and education and background. In short, one does not become or start as an attorney or state legislator, as Senator Nunn did, and then immediately become an esteemed senator. One brings to that position perhaps competencies and skills, but they're going to be tested in a very different political environment. And I think there are three periods of Senator Nunn's career that highlight his leadership and are discussed in detail in my book. This first period runs from Senator Nunn's election in November 1972 until January of 1981. I call that his apprenticeship, but I want to underscore that that's a very brief apprenticeship. It's brief because of the actual occurrence of several events during that period, and also because Senator John Stennis, who is serving as the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, is wounded in a robbery attempt. And Stennis will say that Senator Nunn becomes his eyes and legs, and he appoints him to take on a number of tasks in those first few years of Senator Nunn's senator role. Beginning in 1974 with a study of NATO, very important study because as the United States got out of Vietnam, it had to think about its role with the NATO alliance. Second of all, early in 1975, Senator Stennis sent Senator Nunn to South Vietnam to make an assessment of what was occurring there. And it was only a few months later that the regime fell in South Vietnam. But I think most importantly, and this is a hallmark, I think, of Senator Nunn's entire career, is that he worked with Senator Dewey Bartlett, a Republican from Oklahoma, and the two of them wrote a report on NATO's conventional capabilities and made sure that the public knew that there was a need to upgrade and revitalize NATO's conventional capability. That report itself served as part of the agenda for a fellow Georgian who just entered the White House, Jimmy Carter. And I would add also that this was no mere discussion of what NATO's capabilities were. On the mind of Senator Nunn was something very important to him. How do we raise the threshold between conventional war and nuclear war? A concern of his that if the Soviet Union should attack NATO, the use of nuclear weapons could occur very quickly. I think by the end of this first period, Senator Nunn was seen as having a reputation among his colleagues in the Senate, as well as leaders in the executive branch, to include the president, the leaders in the armed forces, and the media who cover the Hill, as an expert in defense issues. And moreover, he had become an important vote in several key policy issues during this period, most notably in favor of the Panama Canal treaties. He took a stance in favor of those treaties, which was at tremendous odds against that view held by most of his constituents in Georgia. Second period really runs from January of 1981 to January of 1987. And the Democrats are no longer in the majority if they've been in those first few years that he had served there. It's a period in which Ronald Reagan is the president. And I want to point out, I think, what is two telling parts of this that are very important in terms of his career. That's first one is Senator Nunn's really important work that he did on nuclear arms control. Although that's not an issue that is normally considered within the jurisdiction of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Senator Nunn broadened the understanding of arms control and linked it to defense policy and national security issues. He was able to talk about how it fit with American nuclear doctrine. And he also made it part of the United States nuclear strategy. It is also a period in which there's a great deal of bipartisanship. Senator Nunn reached out to colleagues across the aisle, Republicans such as Senator William Cohen of Maine and Senator John Warner of Virginia. And the second, and perhaps even the more lasting work, is his partnership with Republican Senator Barry Goldwater to fashion the legislation known commonly as the Goldwater Nichols Act of 1986. Senator Nunn's name may not appear on that legislation, but there is no doubt that he was a full partner with Goldwater in this endeavor. And the third period, I think, is perhaps the pinnacle of his career in the Senate. From January 1987, certainly through January 1994, when he serves as chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. And we think about those years, 1987 to 1994, we're seeing the end of the Cold War, and we're seeing the beginning of this so-called New World Order that President Bush talked about. It's a period in which there was an expectation that there would be a peace dividend now that the Soviet Union had unraveled and dissolved. It is this period, I think, that Senator Nunn shows his stewardship of trying to help reframe U.S. policymakers understanding the strategic environment. It's a period in which he shepherds through the National Defense Authorization Act, ensuring that reductions in U.S. Armed Forces force structure and the defense budget are done in a very sensible and practical way. And I think perhaps his most important contribution, his crowning achievement of this period, is the Non-Lugar Act, as the Soviet Union unravels in late 1991. He has the vision to see the criticality of controlling and disposing of the former Soviet Union's nuclear weapons and fissile material, the so-called loose nukes problem. So when one looks at Senator Nunn's career, his leadership on so many issues, it's apparent that he is a congressional leader. But I would contend that his leadership reaches beyond our common understanding of political leadership. It is one of strategic leadership. And by that, I'm defining it as the ability or the capacity to think, to act, and to influence in such a manner that it promotes a comparative, competitive, and sustainable advantage for the United States in a global environment marked by threats and opportunities. Senator Nunn acted as a strategic leader is really my contention. He created a vision of what the United States should do to maintain the international order that it established after World War II. He aligned policy and resources through legislation and other means to promote that vision. And by working within the institution of the Senate, but also with the House of Representatives, the Departments of Defense and State, and the White House, and internationally, he built consensus and thereby met the challenges that the nation and its allies confronted. One final thought, if I could. At this time of often bitter political polarization and partisanship, Senator Nunn's reputation remains that of a statesman, with a record of bipartisanship and a dedication to U.S. national interests above all. His career, which I recount in my book, provides both a lesson in the relationships among the U.S. government, foreign powers, and societies, but also a welcome reminder on the capacity of Congress and even a lone senator to promote and enact policies that can make the country and the world a better and safer place. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Frank. Well, before I turn it over to the Q&A, I want to maybe follow up a couple of points that you've raised and parsed some of the notions behind the sort of strategic leadership that you note. One element of character that I've seen in your writing and your work that is attributed to Senator Nunn had to do with the role of integrity and character as a leader. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how that resonates with the chronology that you've laid out, and what are some of the lessons on that front?
Yeah, I think that, thank you, Adam. I appreciate the question. One looks at Senator Nunn as a person of character. There's a moral and ethical reasoning and moral courage. I mean, the courage of his convictions. I think there are probably 2 or 3 examples that come readily to mind. Certainly his stance on the Persian Gulf, in which he was very much at odds with the President Bush at the time and many others, and his willingness to actually hold hearings and begin a public debate on whether the United States should use force, is an example of someone who is willing to hear out both sides. And even if he was accused, as he was by some, as stacking who those witnesses were at the hearings, which was untrue, it was a point of, again, creating that public debate. And that's a service to the nation. I would say that's one element. The second one, and I know this was a difficult aspect of it, it's quite clear based on some of the historical record, is the Tower confirmation. The John Tower, former senator and Secretary of Defense designate. But again, this was a concern on the part of Senator Nunn, and I would say Senator Warner joined him in this. They had set some criteria as to what their expectations were for the leadership in the department. And in this particular case, because of some past experiences of Senator Tower, Senator Nunn could not vote in favor of a former colleague. And he was excoriated for that in the press and by others. And then I would have to say the Panama Canal Treaty. Certainly not a set of treaties that his constituents were in favor of, but again, having the courage of his convictions to vote in favor of them, to support President Carter. And of course, we can perhaps be amused somewhat by the bumper sticker that once we had a canal, but now we have none, spelled N-U-N-N. He was taken to task for that. And he was certainly taken for task for the Persian Gulf, in which there were actually signs calling him someone who was supporting Saddam Hussein. So I think those are examples of having the courage and convictions. And I would add that in the Panama Canal case in 1978, he's reelected. So again, making those choices, but still being seen by the people of Georgia as someone they could trust and had confidence in.
Great. Before I ask the next question, I want to remind the other folks in the audience to feel free to add some questions in the Q&A so we can extend the conversation as well from your perspectives. I want to bring you to a more of an institutional type of question. Today we hear a lot about majority leaders, speakers of the House and the Senate, but we don't hear a lot about the role of committee chairs. And even as academics and scholars, when we study U.S. foreign policy, we talk about the executive branch. But I was wondering if you could share some of the insights from your research on Senator Nunn about the role of a committee chairperson and some of the techniques that Senator Nunn used to use that role to foster the types of policies and bridge building that you so eloquently mentioned, and also to work with policy entrepreneurs, maybe in the executive branch, to advance certain issues such as the Non-Lugar legislation.
Yeah, by far the Non-Lugar legislation is perhaps a sterling example of someone who is in a position, namely he was the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee at the time. And as I recount in the book, the timing of his role in this is very important because, in my estimation, not only does he go to the Soviet Union and sees what's happening personally, but he is able to, in my view, and pardon the scholarly interpretation, but it's an attempt on his part to see this as what's happening in a world that was often described as bipolar, these two great superpowers. To see Gorbachev, who we've met on several other occasions, to see how perhaps his power is waning, and then also to see the burgeoning perhaps of a democratic movement in the Soviet Union under Yeltsin, and then the very important role that he understands about how nuclear weapons, who has control of nuclear weapons for the Soviet Union during the coup in which Gorbachev is taken out of commission in a sense for a few days. I think those are important questions because he's working at three different levels and then comes back to the United States from Moscow and being able to begin that dialogue. Now, to my estimation, he would even maybe wouldn't perhaps admit to this, but I would suggest that there was a sense of trying to get this done, and it's often difficult at that time when the National Defense Authorization Act is almost ready to be finalized. But I think there's also the recognition that he works across lines. Again, Senator Lugar is an internationalist. They knew each other, Republican from Indiana. But I think what's really telling is how Non-Lugar comes together through a confluence, a convergence of other Republicans and Democrats, others who are also convinced as Senator Nunn, former senators, intelligence community, others, that this is starting to, the Soviet Union is starting to unravel, and this concern about dealing with this issue now. And I think that what we see in that is a willingness to build consensus and coalition building. And the fact that he had more than 20 sponsors on Non-Lugar, I think, is an indication of how he was able to work across that. Despite, and I will say this, despite how perhaps the Bush administration felt about this effort. And so I think that's a sterling example, as I said, of his ability to use his chairmanship, but also to recognize that he wanted to make this a bipartisan issue.
Great. Well, we're starting to get some questions from in the Q&A section, but so as we pivot, before we pivot to those, since we have Senator Nunn on the screen, and I don't want to put you on the spot, and I certainly don't want this to turn into a roast session, but after Frank has written this book and jarred many memories from the past, I was wondering if you had a few words to say about maybe some of the lessons that you think from your experience that are relevant today, especially for forging bipartisanship and leveraging the authorities of the Senate to tackle some of these grand challenges facing the country.
Thank you very much, Adam. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much, Frank. And thank Kathy Gwynn on my staff. Kathy's been with me a long time, and Frank acknowledges in front of his book about how much help Kathy was in making our papers available, because we wanted to make everything available to Frank. We knew what a tremendous writer he was and a great researcher and a great interviewer, and we wanted to fully cooperate. We had nothing to do with what he's written. I've just read the book in the last few days, and I would say that Frank, in addition to enjoying reading it, I want my family and former staff and maybe even some of the reporters that have covered my career, like Jim Galloway and Bill Nygett and Maria Supporter, some of them may be on today, but I wanted them to, when they read the book, to take note of the fact I don't think I have seen the word dull or boring anywhere in your book, and I wanted the reporters to know that and the family to know that, because I get those words thrown about and have for a long time, and probably they're true. But nevertheless, in reading the book, actually over the last few days, I haven't quite finished, but almost. I actually found my adrenaline going up because I was reliving a lot of that. Your words really brought back not only my memories, but some of the tensions and stress that were present in most of the episodes that you related with such expertise. You know, I'm reminded when I think about my career and when I read the book that you have done so well, I'm reminded that staff played such a big role in everything I did. I'm not going to try to name them today. I mean, you got Frank Sullivan, Arnold Panaro, Dick Combs, Eleanor Hill. You got so many people that played such a huge role. But my former colleague, White Fowler, senator from Georgia for 6 years, White used to quote the Bible in a joking way by quoting, and there's a quote to this effect in the Bible saying, Adam leaned on his staff and died. I leaned on my staff and survived and thrived because of the tremendous dedication, professionalism of so many people. So I'm indeed grateful to so many folks, and many of them are on the call today. And let me just make a couple of more points. One is that Colleen, my bride, even if we weren't married, would be one heck of a partner because she was in the CIA before we met, and actually when we met. She was in Paris during a period where the Communist Party was on a real move in both France and Italy. She understood the perils of the Cold War. She was a tremendous partner as we traveled around the globe. She went on many of those trips together. She also, in her own right, was a leader in mental health. And so the next book being written, I think, about the Nunn family should be about Colleen. She has really had a tremendous effect. Colleen also, and this had direct bearing on my career, she was the chairman of the board of Meridian House. And Meridian House is an organization most people haven't heard of in Washington. They know about it very well because it basically helps the diplomatic corps. When new people come to town from any country in the world, the Meridian House helps them get settled and oriented. And Colleen did tremendous amount of work with the Meridian House. And actually, I did not know as many ambassadors as Colleen knew in Washington. She knew ambassadors from people all over the world, and she knew their wives. And one of the things, one of the weekends we enjoyed the most was her idea when we actually invited all the NATO ambassadors and their wives to go down to the Georgia coast to Sea Island. And with the help of my good friend Bill Jones, we entertained them for 2 days. And I know that our friend and great asset for the Nunn School, Phil Breedlove, would have gotten a kick out of that because the NATO ambassadors, Britain, France, Germany, and Belgium, small countries as well as large, basically told us after that 2 days that that was the longest they had visited with each other since they'd been posted in Washington, and all of that was Colleen's doing. But wrapping it up, I guess my career, and Frank outlines this so well, and this continues today, has been involved in sort of digging deep into possible threats against our country, trying to identify the threats, trying to identify what we can do to basically reduce that risk or mitigate the damage coming from those risks, and really trying to educate and help policymakers understand those threats. So I continue in that role today with the Nuclear Threat Initiative. But one thing I would say on a serious note, I don't want to let the audience down today because they're used to me always coming up with new dangers. So I would say that one of our tests over the next 60 days is whether we're going to have a coordinated transition. It's absolutely essential when you're transferring power in a democracy, and virtually all the leadership and the top people in each department, whether it's State Department or whether it's Defense Department, is Treasury, is being changed over. It's imperative to have that kind of coordination. It's not happening now. It's not happening now, and I think that is a real risk to the health of the American people because we've got to decide which vaccines to use, how to distribute that, what's an equitable way, how to work with the world on that, how to get them manufactured. Much of the manufacturing capability is not in this country. So we've got a lot of work to do in that regard, and literally the lives of the American people will depend on that kind of cooperation and coordination with transition between the Biden administration and the Trump administration. So it needs to happen, and this is a particular challenge, I think, to our Republican colleagues in the Senate and in the House. They've got to step up to the plate and basically tell the president that he has got to at least let his people coordinate and cooperate. Otherwise, both national security and health is in peril. So this is a challenge of leadership, and particularly relating to the Republican Party because they're the ones that would have the influence with the White House. Let me just close my remarks by saying, yeah, we got a lot of challenges. We've got existential challenges, nuclear, biological. You have to throw climate in there, maybe even Frank would know more about this than I would, but artificial intelligence and sort of the dark side of technologies. But when you look at America today, you know, I'm extremely optimistic. We've got something we take for granted so often, that's the rule of law. Most countries don't have that. And until it's threatened, we don't quite realize it. We take it for granted. We've got tremendous higher education system. Most people in the world, students want to come to America, and Adam's very much a part of that. Georgia Tech is one of the leaders in the world. And I would say in recent years, our institutions have held, you can call it the dark state, you can call it whatever it is, whatever you want to, but the professionals in the Department of Defense, the professionals in the intelligence agencies, the professionals in the Treasury Department, the professionals throughout government are enormously important, and they have been under assault in recent years, but I would say the professionals have come through by and large, with some exceptions, but we are very, very fortunate to have institutions that have held up in some very difficult circumstances. And finally, I would say that we are the most innovative society in the world. We have tremendous research and development, and again, Georgia Tech is so much a part of that. And so we have so much to be grateful for. And I'm excited in the phase of my life I'm in now, because I'm going to be spending a lot more time working with the students at the Nunn School. And Adam's doing a great job of building crosswalks with the School of Computer Engineering, the cyber school that has been stood up, as well as the School of Mechanical Engineering. So all of those things are taking place. So Frank, bottom line is you've done a tremendous job. I'm very grateful that someone with your professional capability, your experience in the military affairs, and your in-depth knowledge of the things that make the military tick and how those work to help protect us during the Cold War. All of those talents you brought to bear with this book, and I am very, very honored that you have captured my career. I think it's something that I know my children and grandchildren will treasure, and I'm hoping it will help educate young leaders about particularly the emphasis you place, properly so, basically working together between Democrats and Republicans, because as I've said so often, there's not a single major problem that we face in our nation now that doesn't require both parties to not only solve the problem, but to sustain that effort and to give it oversight. So thank you very much, and look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you.
Well, great. Thank you, Senator. Your remarks were quite prescient, because a number of the questions in the Q&A relate to some of the lessons from your past as they're applicable today. And there are a number of questions that really try to get at, and I want to direct this to Frank. Like, when you're looking back at the record and how Senator Nunn was a leader on global issues like nuclear security with the Non-Lugar legislation and efforts, what are some of the lessons that you pick out of that for tackling contemporary issues like cybersecurity, as he mentioned, or the pandemic? A number of our participants are very keen to try to extract that, especially for the next generation. I think it's very popular for students these days to watch The Last Best Chance, that talks about some of the challenges that Senator Nunn's laid out for us. But what are some of the lessons from his experience in tackling some of those grand challenges that he himself just now laid out that face us?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of issues that really have to be understood, and as I said earlier, leadership is an evolutionary process. It requires, and I think Senator Nunn's, I know that Senator Nunn's education and background, but it's this willingness to dig deep into issues, to become familiar with those issues, and to become recognized for your expertise. So expertise is what? It's a technical competency. The second one I would say is conceptual, and I'll come back to that one. And the third is interpersonal. How do you build relationships with individuals? How do you find, even in competitive rivalries, how do you begin to see another person's perspective? That requires empathy, a word that's often misused, but it's a willingness to understand another person's perspective. You don't have to agree with it, but you should understand it. So I think that's 2 points that I'd make. And the third is, and I think this leadership in general is something that goes beyond the Senate or the House of Representatives or the Oval Office. I don't care if you're running a university or you're running a business or you're running a nonprofit organization. And I think the other one is, and I don't know how difficult this is to cultivate, but it's something we try to do at the War College and with our students, is how do you think strategically? How do you understand? How can you think critically about issues? And it's to open up the mind, if you will, in a sense. I didn't use this word. It's a term that comes from Clausewitz, but coup d'oeil, the idea of the mind's eye being open. And one of the things that always often fascinated me about Senator Nunn is his vision. This is perhaps a product of his education, certainly as an attorney, as a lawyer. Certainly Arnold Pernaro, who Senator Nunn mentioned, served on his staff for a number of years, mentions in one of the oral histories about how Senator Nunn was always thinking not about the first or second steps, the fifth or sixth steps. And that's something that has to be learned and developed and fostered. And I think that ability to reframe, to not be caught in our day-to-day biases, but to understand how the environment around us is changing, how the ecosystem doesn't remain the same. And having that ability to understand that and to conceptualize how yesterday and today are not the same, regardless. And certainly as we face a pandemic or any other challenge as a nation, or even globally, whether it's climate change or some of the other ones, again, it's that ability to reframe it and its ability to see other people's perspective. Strategic empathy, I would argue, is part of that leadership repertoire that has to be developed as well.
Great. Well, you mentioned personal relationships, and as an aside, or as an important element to that, the ability to cut across the aisle and national boundaries. And as an aside, someone who's traveled with Senator Nunn several times to Russia, I was always, several Russians used to come up to me and whisper in my ear that they thought Non-Lugar was one person because he so embodied the empathy that you just talked about. And Senator Nunn has always seemed to have the right joke for the right moment to break the ice. And so a number of questions from the Q&A relate to some of the personal issues, especially his work ethic. What are some of the lessons about that, either in preparing for a television interview or a hearing? What are some of the hallmark traits in that regard that stand out for you?
Well, I credit not only Senator Nunn, as he was so eloquently put it, the staff doing those hours of work, but also his own willingness very, very early in his career, literally spending days preparing for that first trip in 1974 to go to NATO and examine that on behalf of Senator Stennis, doing that deep analysis, his willingness to talk to people and learn from them, whether he was standing outside the equivalent of the Russian parliament, if you will, or he was standing outside the wire at a facility in West Germany. It's that willingness to learn and to hear others' perspectives and to take that in as part of who he is. I'm totally, a couple of things come readily to mind. The number of hours and days that he spent looking at the treaty information, the background information, the negotiating record for the ABM treaty as the anti-ballistic missile treaty was being reinterpreted by the Reagan administration, the hours he spent looking at that and could speak to it and getting that recognition by John Warner of Virginia about how he believed that Senator Nunn had read the record. It was evident from his detailed information on his floor speeches. So that level of preparation, and I would suggest perhaps some of it is just because of being a good attorney, he knows that he should dot every I and cross every T. But it's also that willingness to recognize, and again, we're going back to competencies. What's a technical competency? It's knowing your business and knowing it well. And in an institution of 100 people, having the trust and confidence of your colleagues that you know what you're talking about. Having worked on the Hill as a congressional fellow, I'll just say that it became evident that no member can keep up with everything. And so they have to rely on those who have the expertise, those who have done the homework, those who are willing to stand and teach them, educate them. And that's part of it. educating colleagues, educating the American public, educating constituents.
Several members of the audience wanted to know a little bit more about some of those points you're mentioning. Who did he learn from? Who did he interact with? Some folks have identified a resonance of his experience with Carl Vinson, and obviously the relationship there. Like people like that, titans of the U.S. political scene. Who are some of those titans that Senator Nunn learned from to convey the knowledge that you just were explaining?
Yeah, let's start with the most important titans, his mother and father. Let's start with that. What can you learn at the dinner table? Senator Nunn's father had been heavily involved in public affairs, and his mother was a teacher, and so that he learned from them. There's the first titans. I mean, as I said before, our leadership comes from background, and it comes from education, it comes from experience. And so whether it was his time in the Boy Scouts or his work on sports, the teams, he starts really early. Titans, certainly Carl Vinson is certainly an important factor in his election in terms of support and his education and working for him early on the House Armed Services Committee. But I would also point out that Senator Nunn learned from Senator Stennis and others. I would talk about Senator Scoop Jackson as an example. It's interesting that when Senator Jackson died, there were many people, and it's not me, it was many people who said that the mantle of responsibility had been passed from Senator Jackson to Senator Nunn, that he was the inheritor of that. So I think that's an important part. I think he learned also, and as I recount in the book, even as a junior member of the Senate, his willingness to speak out on an issue that was in opposition to the majority leader, Mike Mansfield. That willingness, and Senator Nunn probably would comment on this, that here was a junior senator challenging burden-sharing provisions on NATO after the Vietnam War about drawing down troops in Europe. And here's an important part of learning that one doesn't take retribution. The Senate of the 1970s was very much a collegial and club-like atmosphere. So I'd mention those two, Senator Mansfield, Senator Jackson, Senator Stennis. But again, the willingness to work with other colleagues. And I could keep going through this, but I think there's many other people that are we could consider as people who educated him, brought him and developed him. And that's an important part as a young member of the Senate, in the first years of the Senate. He gains his own expertise.
Senator, would you like to chime in on this point? Or?
Well, I think Frank is exactly right. He named the people in the Senate that had a big effect on me. And, of course, the partners I had on the Republican side had a big effect. We learned from each other and we trusted each other, not in the sense, and this is what people have a hard time grasping, I think, is not in the sense we agreed on everything. Lugar and I didn't agree on everything, but we put the cards on the table, and when he told me something, I trusted him. Let's take a look at what you see today and what worries me about where we are politically in the country. If you look at the television ads today, you would basically think that not that the opponent was wrong or mistaken, but that the opponent needs to go to jail. Basically, people are getting on television and accusing folks of things that are by nature criminal offenses. And you'd say, well, why put this ad on television? You better go down to the U.S. attorney and swear out a criminal warrant if that's true. So I mean, we're getting away from that. It used to be that we didn't have that much negativity, but what's happened in recent years, and I really worry about this, is that if you took Pepsi and Coca-Cola and every day you saw ads that one or the other of them was saying about the other one, you drink this and you're going to die immediately. That would destroy the brand. It would not only destroy the brand, it would destroy the category. Same thing with United Airlines and Delta or any other businesses. They don't do that to each other. They compete like mad and they advertise, but basically the political leadership, not just leadership, but rank and file, basically have escalated the charges against each other, and I think the brand has been damaged. But in terms of influence on me, what Frank said about the various folks, that's certainly true. But also, as he said about my mother and father, that's really, really true, very, very accurate. And then also I had a basketball coach who must have said 10,000 times, you got to pay the price. By that he meant if you really want to be a basketball player, you had to really sacrifice. You had to put in the hours, put in the practice, be willing to tolerate injuries, all of those things. So, and actually, his wife had a big influence on me after I actually got to Washington. I don't know whether it was the Panama Canal or the labor law reform. It was a couple of these issues that were really generating a tremendous amount of heat. Everybody, one side or the other of it. She wrote me a letter, handwritten letter. Her name was Miss Chloe Staples. And she said, Dear Senator Nunn, I watched you grow up. I taught you in Sunday school. He said, I don't know what the right answer is on the Panama Canal. I trust your judgment, and I know you are going to do what's right. Well, you get all this pressure, and you get all this mail, you get all these phone calls. You really also get a lot of threats, not physical, but we're going to vote against you, vote you out of office, et cetera. And then you start saying, well, I got to respond to that. And then you scratch your head and say, hey, who's representing Miss Chloe Staples? She doesn't know the answer and doesn't pretend to, but she relies on me. Not because I'm smarter, but because I was able to be elected and hear from experts. And so I felt that my role was to listen to the experts and find answers, advocate those answers, and then explain it to my constituents. Not that they would all agree, but there's an educational aspect in politics. And Frank, I think the committees are not playing the role they once did, because committees can be educational vehicles for the senators. They can help form, look at the jury system in America. You get 12 folks together who've never met each other. They come from different economic spheres, different businesses, so forth, different professions, different races, creeds, so forth. But they listen to the evidence in front of them for 2 days, 3 days, a week, whatever the case may be, whether it's civil or criminal. They come together, and remarkably, the jury system works. That's the way the committee systems need to work. That helps build consensus. And it basically, right now, I don't see that committee system working. I think there's been way too much shift to the leadership. Now, the leadership has their responsibilities, but the committees and the committee chairs and the ranking members have a duty to educate not only the members, but also help educate the news media and the country. And that's a role that is eroded somewhat.
Yeah, but could I just add something to that, Adam?
Sure.
I would add that in addition to that, it's to play the political scientist for a moment. It's also incumbent upon the executive branch to want to enter into that dialogue, and part of that is the willingness to get up and testify, to go to hearings, to make those statements, and to have that exchange. Otherwise, it's just talking in a vacuum, in my estimation. So there has to be that willingness to go to the Hill in front of the Senate and the House committees and make that case and explain things and not be reluctant to do so. That's just personal opinion.
Great.
Great.
Well, Frank, we have a couple of questions from the audience that talk about Senator Nunn's strong track record for fiscal responsibility. And I was wondering if you can say a few words about that, and then maybe some of the lessons for tackling some of the fiscal challenges that face the country moving ahead, at least for the next 4 years. Is that something that you were looking into?
Yes, I do. I think the case of the end of the Cold War from 1991 basically till 1996, in which Senator Nunn was involved, one of the chapters is titled Finding a Manageable Glide Path. How do you deal with, and this happens throughout his career, but particularly from the Reagan years on, how do you deal with the size of the deficits, which we see today, the debt that the nation confronts? Those are not new issues. How do you deal with that aspect? Sequestration, which happened a few years, is not new. something very akin to that happened previously. It's why we have Graham's, Hollings, Rudman Act back in the 1980s. So, and I think part of it is trying to be responsible stakeholder, Senator Nunn and his colleagues, and particularly in the years after the idea of getting a peace dividend. And what does that look like? What does that do when you all of a sudden draw down the military forces? What happens to the employment situation? What happens in a period of recession, which was occurring at the same time? So those type of issues are ones that he looked at. He looked at how the industries would be involved. There was a discussion also of the industrial base. So those are the type of issues that are not new. They're the ones we confront today. How do we recover first? How do we recover, not rebound, recover the economy and the economic dislocation that we've seen over the last several months? That would be a challenge, regardless of who would be in the House, Senate, or the Oval Office. So I think those are finding those common ground. And as I recount in the book, there's some tension there that Senator Nunn and others had with the Budget Committee, who's also trying to find ways to cut. And there's where the knives come out. I don't mean that in a personal sense, just in the sense of how do you divvy up? How do you ensure that there's balance? How do you ensure there's balance, particularly at a time as we face not just the pandemic issue or the economic or the trade issues, but also if we are really truly in an era of great power competition, how do we think about that as well? So I think those are illustrative of the type of challenges, but they're not new challenges in the truest sense of that word, because they are part and parcel of the decisions government has to make with respect to balancing budgets or getting debt and deficits in control, et cetera. So I think there's a lot we can learn from how they tried to manage from 91 through 96. And the terrorist threat was not something that Senator Nunn neglected. Well, perhaps that's at the back of our minds today because of some of the other issues we face, but that has not gone away either. And he was thinking about that well before many others were thinking about it. So I just bring up that yes, there are lessons we can learn, but they're not easy answers to it.
Okay. Several questions have asked a little bit more about what are some of the lessons for contending with defeat on legislation, or missed opportunities, or decisions, after the hard work and the painstaking efforts to ratify a treaty or come to advance legislation that they were reversed or reinterpreted by the executive branch or others. So I guess the lessons for dealing with the dark side, the frustrations, the challenges, the missed opportunities, and things like that. What are some of the lessons that come out of that?
I think that any member of the House and Senate has a recognition that there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of bills that come in and put in the hopper every year, so to speak. The vast majority of them will never see anything beyond the committee or the subcommittee. So I would assume, and perhaps this is a good question, maybe to reframe that question, is why do people leave today, the House and the Senate? Is that because of frustration, because, as Senator Nunn mentioned, because so much has been centralized or brought into the leadership role, and that the committee chairs and subcommittee chairs don't have the role and responsibility they have? Is it because of perhaps the loss of expertise? If you have limitations on how long you can serve as a chair or as a ranking member? And as Senator Nunn was saying, what is the atmosphere that we live in? Is it so toxic that it creates other problems in terms of the willingness to cooperate? Cooperate, not even collaborate, to cooperate. So I think that's a part of the issue too. And this is a recognition that you start as a member, and today I think there's an expectation, perhaps because of how campaign financing is going, about how that influences power in these 535 individuals who are elected. And I think that has a big impact on how people see themselves and as centers of their own power. That's a very different atmosphere than the 70s or 80s and 90s, I would suggest to you. I would also suggest that part of it is also there's an inflection point in the 1990s. So probably Senator Nunn could speak to that himself, but I think there's that a part of it. And I think you have to be resilient. And you have to recognize that you're not going to win. And I can, as somebody who was on, as I said, a legislative fellow on a staff watching that, do you take benefit of knowing you supporters are there, your constituents believe in you, but you also take a great deal of satisfaction even in the small victories, being heard, yeah.
Thank you. So we've reached the conclusion of our time, but I would invite Senator Nunn if you want to say any sort of final observations or thoughts that have been jarred by the conversation. I don't.
Well, Adam, right now, we are in a transition period, and I've already outlined some of the dangers of that in terms of foreign policy, intelligence, adversaries taking advantage of our focus on the elections and so forth. So, I have thought for a long time we needed to take a real step to have Congress be in a position to carry out their responsibilities under the constitutional responsibility of declaring war. That's one of the most important responsibilities Congress has under the Constitution. And if you look at the record, the last 20, 30 years, it's eroded, and the War Powers Act is not working now. But one of the things that could be done is not the whole solution, but the leadership of the House and Senate, Democrat and Republican leaders, could appoint some committee chairs right now, intelligence, armed services, and so forth, to be, I would call it a liaison group with the executive branch during this transition where we've got 60 days and we've got dangers, but it should carry over. That group of people, I'd call it liaison group, oversight group, whatever, would be responsible to stay in close touch with the Defense Department, State Department, intelligence communities, and understand the threats in the world before we get into a war, and basically be able to lead. I mean, a lot of people are worried now, properly so, about when the realization is that one person can push the nuclear button. The question of who you elect, you're electing someone who can basically destroy the world. That's who you're electing when you elect the President of the United States. Same thing in Russia. Is that a sustainable proposition for the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years? With cyber, the possibility of accidents and so forth. So I think Congress has got, if you're going to basically alter the system we have now, where one person has sole authority to make these nuclear decisions, you got to have a responsible Congress that can make decisions quickly. And that means you have to have liaison between the branches. We did some of that back when George Shultz was Secretary of State, and we had the treaties going on. You had Reykjavik going on. You had the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, and that was more coordination than I ever saw during my period in Washington. It was a Reagan administration. George Shultz deserved a lot of leadership, but Robert Byrd, and Robert Dole were the two leaders, Republican, Democrat. They appointed a committee that Ted Stevens and I co-chaired with the two leaders. Ted was a Republican from Alaska, and we basically looked at the treaties as they were being negotiated. I bet I had 7, 8, 10 meetings one-on-one with George Shultz in the Secretary of State's office, talking about the various opportunities and dangers of that period of time in arms control. That's the kind of thing that has to happen. You have to have people communicating before there's a crisis, because when there's a crisis, decisions have to be made very rapidly. So those are some of the things that can be done. Another thing that I'm advocating right now, and I hope the Biden administration will tackle this, and that is a fail-safe review of our nuclear systems, our command and control systems, and our warning systems. Not a treaty, not an agreement, not a bilateral, multilateral matter, but having our own Department of Defense go through our systems, look at the cyber threat to warning and command and control, and that cyber threat is growing all the time. Look at the possibility of false warnings and take every step we can to reduce the risk, and then challenge every other nuclear country to do their own internal review. Out of that, we may get some red lines that we can agree on cyber, because if we all use our cyber to the greatest extent possible to spook command and control systems and to try to penetrate warning systems, at some point we're going to have an accident. So I think myself, I'm convinced that the chances of a war by blunder have gone up, particularly nuclear accidents and so forth. And that's an area where Congress needs to step up to the plate. And so there are all sorts of things that can be done together in what I call the existential risk box that I believe are an acute responsibility of Congress. But again, I want to close by saying I'm optimistic about America, because just look at the number of people we had voting. Whether you're a Republican or Democrat, whether you voted for Trump or Biden, it's clear that people care. And people care about our country. They care about governance. Yes, there are differences, but we have ways of bridging those gaps. And it's just going to take some leadership to do so. But I'm optimistic about the future. I'll close on that note and close by thanking Frank, you and Adam, for your leadership. And Frank, thank you again. I won the lottery in finding someone with your talent and knowledge and ability to basically capture the heart of the various issues that we confronted and do it with skill and words that people can understand. So thank you for tackling this assignment. And I'm going to continue to see if you put boring in there, but so far I haven't found it.
Well, thank you, Senator. On that note of challenge and optimism, I would be remiss if I didn't remind everybody to go buy the book. It is hot off the presses, and you can you can purchase it and find out where you can purchase it via the University of Kansas Press website. I also want to thank Chris McDermott at the Nunn School and Kathy Gwynn at the Nuclear Threat Initiative for helping us pull this together. But I really want to thank Frank for actually taking on the challenge and producing such an accessible and enlightening book, and that does have resonance, as we've been discussing today, for the challenges that we face not only today but in the future. And of course for Senator Nunn for giving us that legacy to be the bellwether for us as we forge ahead. So with that, let me thank you both again and thank the audience for joining us today. And remember, this is just to whet your appetite. This is the beginning of our Nunn Forum series, and the next one will be occurring at the end of January, and so stay tuned for more information on it. So with that, thank you again. Take care and be safe.
Thank you.